Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Now in this video we're going to break down the new Alliance War map, and if you're anything like me, season 43 just ended, you were taking a big exhale, going to get that nice off-season break. Maybe you went to go change your defenders out to get some off-season defenders in there, and then you're like, what the heck is going on? What is this map? It's so confusing. And I'm going to try to sort of dispel the fear and anxiety that's coming with this, because there's a lot that's different, but there's a lot that's exactly the same. There are some pretty big implications for alliances that do not plan every node. I'm going to get into that a little bit. And essentially the structure of this video is, first I'm going to just kind of talk about the layout of the map and what that means. We're going to talk a little bit about the mini bosses, and then we're going to go path by path, because there are some pretty significant node changes that are going to make some of the node combos a little bit more limiting and a little bit harder to plan for. So we're going to get into all of that. I am kind of like cautiously optimistic that all these changes to Alliance War are going to lead to a better mode over time. Right now it does feel a little overwhelming, and like it's just going to be more work for officers and all that. But anytime a change happens, it's important to remember that it's always hardest right at the beginning of the change. So even though I'm feeling a little anxious and a little upset about this, I do think that I'm trying to give it the benefit of the doubt. And the reason I'm making this video is to kind of do the research and sort of educate myself so that I can help other people, but also to create a tool for you so that when you're planning, you think about these things ahead of time. So anyway, let's get into the structure of the map first. Essentially, there's portals everywhere now, and the way the new map works is, I guess the first thing I should talk about is that there are now exactly 50 nodes on the map. That's an important thing to remember. Some of the old shared fights, and I think one mini boss, are completely gone. Now that might sound nice, but what it also means is that there will not be any empty nodes on the map anymore. There used to be more nodes than there were defenders to place, which means maybe on your path there was an empty node. It would lighten your load a little bit, might make it a little bit easier for you to bring a counter to a mini boss. Well, now if everybody places, anyone taking a full lane is going to have to take a full 4 fights. Now obviously there is room for a backup. If you can coordinate a backup, that won't be the case, but the majority of players, like, hey, I'm taking path 6, it means you're going to have to take all 4 fights every single war, because there's not going to be empty nodes. So that is definitely something that's going to increase the load per player. The other thing is that your lanes in section 1 and section 2 are stacked back to back without any fights in the middle. So essentially, like, I'm taking path 8, I'm going to take that Medusa, I'm going to take that Diablo, I'm going to warp straight to 8B, take these 2 fights, and then all the fights that used to be these shared fights at the ends of the lanes and some of the mini bosses from before are stacked on these 3 islands. These, I'm kind of calling them the mini boss islands, because that's what they are. And then there's a regular boss island with 4 mini bosses that are somewhat familiar to the old ones and the boss. You can bypass any of these mini islands if you want. You can go straight from your path to the big boss island. You can take 1 fight per little pod here, or you could take 2 fights or all 3. The one thing to note though is that if somebody takes this null over here, they're not going to be able to take the Doom or the Sauron, right? So again, this is another feature. It's going to increase the load per player, because those players that used to take 11, 12, 13 fights per war, now the maximum amount of fights that any one person can take is 10, right? Because we're talking about the 4 lane fights, the 3 fights here, and then the 2 mini bosses and 1 boss. So, if you're in an alliance where there's a few people who have big rosters and love war, and they're taking a lot of the difficult fights, and you only have to worry about your path, you're going to have a little bit more to do now. And in alliances that don't plan every single node, it just means that there's going to be need for more coordination and need for thinking about your teams a little bit more, which is probably going to lead to more deaths overall. So it's just something you're going to have to get used to. We do have the 1 loyalty revives to get through these things so that they're not going to be awful. But I think in general, that's going to make the mode a little bit less fun to play, in my opinion. And then kind of the last thing I want to say sort of in this vein is that in the old map, essentially you would finish section 1, and let's say you were on either path 7, 8, or 9, and there was always a shared fight at the end of your path in this section that sort of had some of the elements of the nodes that you just took, and there was sort of an unspoken agreement that if you were on path 7, 8, or 9, the three of you would sort of as a pod make sure that you had counters for these shared nodes. The same thing would go for the end of section 2. Now these fights are all sort of spread out on these mini islands here, which just means that on paper it seems better, right? Because it means all 10 people have access to all these fights. It means you may have a better counter overall, but it does sort of create a little bit more responsibility on coordinating, a little bit more responsibility on the officers to make sure that these get assigned. Whereas in the old system, you basically just had to talk to 2 other people and really just make sure that among those folks you had counters, and it was just sort of, again, like this unspoken thing, like, hey, you're going to take care of that side of the map, I don't have to worry about it. The only time we need to really coordinate these counters is if we know that there's going to be some shared mini bosses later. So it's just sort of like a paradigm change. I think it's going to be worse at first, but over time I think people are going to find it's not that bad. It's just one of those things that it's going to take more overall group coordination than just like, hey, this pod, I know that you're all set on that side of the map. Just something to consider. So now we're going to get into the actual nodes. I do want to go path by path eventually because there are some pretty important implications that are going to limit the counters to some of the nodes that we are familiar with from the past. But let's get into these mini bosses. So on this first mini island, like where this Doom is, this node with the resistance is feudal and personal space regen, this is the end of section 1, path 1, 2, and 3 on the left side of the map. So that node is essentially the same, but like I said, it's not where it used to be, it's at the end. So hopefully somebody that's on path 1, 2, or 3 can bring a counter to this and take it, and everything will be fine. Where this null is, this is the end of 4, 5, and 6 in section 1, right? Ebb and flow knockdown, right back at it. It's the same node. I took this node a lot. Now this Sauron, this is an interesting one. This is old node 25. It's got the power stings and it's got the power snack. This was the gate right before you got to lane 4, 5, and 6 in section 2. Now of nodes, I used to almost always take the ebb and flow shared node and the power snack node, right? Because I would go straight up the middle. And now that option does not exist, right? So somebody else is going to have to bring a counter. That's kind of what I was talking about, like the max load of fights for any one individual has gone down. It means more people have to bring more counters to spread the wealth. That could be bad. I don't know. We'll have to see. Now, on this next mini island, this is the end of section 2 of path 1, 2, and 3, right? That, you know, it's got the energy resistance and the burden of might. So that node is essentially the same. And again, anybody on path 1, 2, and 3, you probably have a counter for this. You just need to make sure that you have it at the end of the map and everything works out great. Now, this Kate Bishop here, this is an interesting one. This is the old node 23, arguably one of the hardest nodes on the map. It's got root, it's got bubble shield, it's got power focus 2. You know, a lot of people used to put Nick Fury there. It was just one of the hardest fights on the map. This is all the way up here. So your champs are going to be beat up. You've already done a bunch of the war map, and then you have to do that very difficult node. And like I said, if you take that node, you can't take the nodes next to it. So it just means if one of your strongest players was always taking that node, they will have fewer nodes to take. Just something to note. Now where this Ant-Man is, this is the end of section 2 of path 7, 8, 9, right? This is on the far right, the final node before the mini boss island. It's essentially the same, but notice this new overwhelming odds node. Defender gains 25% attack for each buff on them. I don't remember if that used to be there, but it does mean some potentially additional attack. But yeah, that one, we'll talk about that node a little bit later because it comes up elsewhere. Now, potentially one of the worst changes for alliances that don't plan is this next mini boss island. We have 3 hazard shift fights, and now in fairness, they are all different immunities, right? This is the old node 22, incinerate, shock. insult to injury. This is the old node 49, incinerate poison, stun immunity, that old mini boss. And then this shared fight is the old node 26, conflictor, shock, bleed. Now I get it, they all have different immunities. You want to encourage your members to bring champs with immunities. But the issue is, in a lot of alliances that don't have the time to plan, that don't want to put that burden on their officers to make plans, you could usually take these fights with Kingpin or Absorbing Man or Iceman, or sometimes even Red Hulk could take 2 of the different types of immunities just because he's so good with the Incinerate buildup. Now, all of these hazard shift fights, you're going to need 3 individuals to take each one of them. It can't just be rely on the Path 9 person to take all the hazard shifts on the map. That's going to cause problems, and I don't know if Kabam sees it that way, but in my experience, there's sort of an unwritten rule that, you know, if you don't have an officer planning for you, you plan for your lane. You may have plenty of champs ranked up that have immunities, but you may not be able to find room for them on your 3-person team, simply because, you know, you would hope that somebody who's on the immunity lane can have a counter for this. So this is going to spread people a little thin if you're not assigning every node. I'm kind of calling that now, and it's just something interesting to note. The rest of the mini bosses, they're basically the same, but they're in a weird order, right? So this is the old one with the mist that used to be on the left side, and then it's followed by the old stunning reflection, but they got rid of the brute force node itself and they added brute force here. So that's going to make this a lot harder, right? It's got polka dot power and stunning reflection, so you are going to be like baiting a lot of heavies, baiting a lot of specials, which means you're going to have to be a little bit more patient, and adding brute force to it is going to make it a lot harder. Like, I'm picturing when people put America Chavez here, you have to be patient, right? You can't rush that fight, and now that there's brute force on top of it, it's going to make it a little bit more difficult. So that's something to note. And then over here on this side, again, these are in a weird order now. This is the old node 54 with improved power gain, the one where people love to put Mangog, enhanced special 2. So that's there. And then the final mini over here is actually the prowess puncture one that used to be kind of in the middle. I know a lot of people like to put Bishop here, for example. So yeah, I don't know yet the implications of what that all is going to mean, but they're in a different order and they added brute force to one. So by default, I think it's a little bit harder, but it is what it is. Not much we can do about that. And then the boss node itself is the same. And again, we are in the challenger tier. It looks like True Strike is back. Actually, this is something I'm just noticing. So I don't know if that's a mistake, but if True Strike is back, it's going to mean that Spidey 99 is back to being amazing. I'll have to ask Kabam if that's meant to be there. I have a feeling it's not, but because I didn't see anything in the forum post about it. But hey, at least for now, True Strike is there. Now, finally, before we get to path by path, I am going to put chapters in this so that if you want to learn about your path, you can go straight to it. But the other thing to note is they said this in the forum post, they are changing it so that everybody gets the same defense and offense tactic in tier 1 through 5. You know, alliances that haven't been getting these tactics, you will not have to worry about that still. But what it means is that, you know, we were still getting unsteady ground. We would have still been getting prowess power in the future. Everybody's going to get the new one, which is called like Sugar Pill and Decay or something like that. So that's just something to note when you're planning, that it's going to be more consistent. You won't have all these different defense tactics to learn. My hope is that the attack tactics, you still get access to all 5 if you're in tier 3, 4, and 5, but I have yet to hear that in an announcement to be sure. It would just happily be my hope if that were the case. All right, now we're going to kind of speed round this. We're going to go path by path, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's different. So starting with path 1, if you are a path 1 warrior, the second node is not different in challenger map, but it is different in tier 1 and 2. They added vigorous assault, so there's just going to be some unblockable to deal with. This masochism node used to not be too difficult. They probably figure a lot of people used to just skip this node, putting a defender on it at all. Now you can't skip the node, so they made it harder. However, if you're in the lower tiers, like tier 3 and below, which isn't that low, that's still pretty competitive, but if you're in tier 3 and below, you don't have to worry about it. I'm just saying that. I think all the other ones do apply to all the nodes. Next up, Path 1B. This now has Arc Overload in addition to Buffet over time. So now if you are going buff immune type champ, you're still going to have to deal with some form of regen. If you don't have any counter to the regen, you're going to have to deal with double regen. I think in tier 1, this is Arc Overload 2.1, which means every 15 seconds you're going to get this. So there's going to be a lot of regen happening here. You may want to bring a counter. That's the main difference there. It doesn't really change the vibe of the node, but it definitely makes it a little bit more dangerous if you don't have a counter. So Path 1 warriors, now you know. Now, path 2, we're going to look at section 1, this second node here. This has Sadist, right? Now, Sadist is one of those nodes that you don't think matters until all of a sudden you're placing a bunch of debuffs and then they're hitting like a truck. Now, this is exactly the same. The thing is, though, a lot of people just use buff immune here, right? Because if you put a nasty Mystic on this node, all these placebo buffs are going to be expiring. It's going to feed Mystic Dispersion and bad things are going to happen. Now, who do you use to counter Mystic champions? Usually Science champions. What do Science champions usually have? A lot of debuffs. So Sadist, it's going to make it a little harder, right? If you're using Titania or Spidey 99, they're placing a lot of debuffs. It means you're going to have fewer mistakes to make. So path 2, make note of that. Now, also path 2, on section 2, the EMP modification node, again, really, really nice for buff immune champs, right? Or shock immune. They added Prey on the Weak, which is like Mystic Dispersion in node form. So again, if you have buff immune, this is going to make no difference because Prey on the Weak isn't going to proc for you. But if you are bringing in somebody for shock immunity, and they're already a Mystic with Mystic Dispersion, and then they have Prey on the Weak on top of it, it means power gain is going to be a little rough, okay? So just keep that in mind. Prey on the Weak is one of my least favorite nodes, especially when it shows up in incursions. In war, you have time to plan for it, but just know that that's there. It makes the node harder. That is absolutely for sure going to be harder. All right, next up, path 3. On path 3A, where is it? Path 3A, I think the first node, here it is. This is what I was talking about, the overwhelming odds node. I did not know what this node was until today. It means 25% attack for every buff on them, on the defender. This is like Sadist, but for buffs. So this means, you know, if you are bringing somebody that's removing the armors, you're going to be fine here. If you're using somebody to punish the armors, like Gallen's still going to be fine, believe me, but it just means that their attack is going to increase as they get armors. So if you're not removing the armors stacking is going to lead to more attack. If you make a mistake, you'll die. It just kind of limits the amount of mistakes you can make if you're bringing Gallen, but Gallen pretty much owns it, so I'm not super worried about that, but it is something to note. Now here is, I guess you could call it a direct nerf to Nebula. She was very popular for this node. When it's got static defense, it means, you know, shocks are going to place on yourself, and then you can just turn her into like super Nebula and just release a ton of damage through shocks. They added shock immunity, so now Nebula is completely neutered on this node. She obviously still is immune to shock herself, so she can just kill them with basic hits and specials, but all of her damage is not going to be happening. That cheesy interaction is gone, unfortunately. I'm not a huge fan of this because, like, I mean, I don't know how much it was hurting the game for somebody to have to bring a Nebula on their team for one fight. You know, if already they needed to make decisions about team planning, you know, Nebula doesn't always fit. Now that option's completely gone. So I'm not a big fan of like completely shutting down an OP counter, but nonetheless, that's how path 3 is going to work. All right, now path 4, there's only one change. Path 4, section 2. This used to be crumbling armor. This used to be if you were too passive, you got an armor break on you, that could interact with also having the heal block debuff, and then one more debuff, they go permanently unblockable. Now there is painful retreat, which means power stings are going to naturally happen on you. And listen, nobody is power sting immune, whereas there were many armor break immune champions. You bring Dr. Doom, he can't be armor broken. You're never going to have to worry about the unblockable on this node if it works. Now in this case, everyone's going to be getting these power stings. They do stack if you don't land enough combo. So if you have somebody, if you're not landing a lot of hits, you're going to get multiple power stings on you, and the node itself can turn them unblockable. Not to mention the fact that if you have a power sting on yourself, you're not going to want to throw specials, which means your combo is going to be less. So this node is significantly more hard. You know, a lot of people used to put null here. This is going to be a lot worse. It's going to be a lot worse than facing null on this node now, because, you know, armor break immunity, if you're using somebody for that, is not going to work. Nobody's immune to power sting. Like, yes, Moon Dragon can kind of counter power sting, but the debuff is still on her. You're going to have to get her into her like ascended mode and purify all the debuffs. I don't think a lot of people are bringing Moon Dragon for this fight. Maybe they will now, I don't know. That's a big difficulty spike in my opinion. Not something to laugh at there. Now path 5, they didn't change much here. They just added aggression precision. Now, aggression precision seems like a nothing node, except in those fights where you're trying to find an opening because for some reason you can't get an opening. They keep throwing their heavies. It's got heavy hitter. They go unstoppable. Now all of a sudden they have like 10 precision passives on them. If you get hit once, it's going to crit, right? So this just makes this node more dangerous. Like, once again, the theme of these new changes are they're making mistakes more painful. This is harder. This node generally is not that difficult, but like, say they place a Havoc, say you don't have someone who can parry non-contact hits, he's going to be gaining a lot of precisions, right? Because you're not hitting him that much. It means if you get hit by him, it's going to hurt really bad. He's going to crit. Getting hit by multiple crits in a row is almost always going to kill you no matter what node. So yeah, it doesn't seem that bad, but it is a lot more dangerous. Now path 6, we can do a whole video on this. They Nimrod proofed this lane. Okay, so there's new nodes. I'm not going to go over all the nodes, but essentially there's a new one called insurance policy. If you remove prowess, then the defender gains a burst of power, 25% of a bar. So this is kind of like the prowess power node of before, where it's like prowess champions are going to be gaining a lot of power. They're discouraging you from just cheesing it with Nimrod. Again, I'm not a big fan of this. Like, I was seeing in R tier, people don't always bring Nimrod here, but sometimes if it fits, you do it. It makes your life easier. You can be more flexible with your team by bringing that nuke, and then you have more champs to take mini bosses later. Now it's going to have to be a little bit more finessed, which, like, on the grand scheme of things is nice for the game, but it's going to make it harder, right? So the one good thing is prowess power does not exist as a tactic anymore. As I said earlier in the video, they got rid of that so that everybody is going to have the same defense tactic. That would be a nightmare if someone brought an armor burn champ and then this was happening. It would yeah. So that's gone, fortunately. But you do need to know that now this node is going to really hurt Nimrod, and I probably some other champions that have some sort of prowess removal. Similar here, this gives a flourish buff. It just means more power rate, more combat power. So you cannot cheese these fights with Nimrod. Additionally, in this one, it's called Band-Aid Solutions. It's energy resistance, which again, that will neuter Nimrod just a little bit because his shocks, right? So it says if you apply a shock, oh look, who applies shocks? Nimrod, right? He applies a lot of shocks. It does energy resistance, so you're not going to be able to nuke them down. Now, if I see Weapon X here, I'm probably still bringing Nimrod or Lady Deathstrike or something. But you know, either way, it's just encouraging more diversity in the teams you make. But it also means that, you know, relying on your favorite nukes and things like that are going to be a little bit harder. So just these nodes are essentially the same. They just Nimrod proofed them a little bit. I'm sure Nimrod is still going to be fine though. All right, we are almost done. Path 7. Path 7 is completely different. I mean, it's the same vibe, but they changed some major things. First of all, let's go back to section 1. Some of them are easier, some of them are harder. This one has attacker special burst lockdown. It used to have the one where you stand close to them and debuffs naturally happen on them. That one was more dangerous. Attacker special burst lockdown means you throw a special, it puts debuffs on them. If they cleanse them, you get damage back. So essentially, if you go into this fight with any champion and you don't throw specials, that's never going to be a problem. In some ways, it makes the node easier. The second node, I don't know why, but they added 40% physical resistance. making them more tanky. I know a lot of people like to put Dragon Man here because when you knock him down, it puts the armor break on him. He starts degenning you. For some reason now there's physical resistance, so the fight is going to last longer, making it potentially more dangerous. 40% is pretty decent, so you're going to want to use somebody with energy damage. Yeah, I guess Apocalypse won't work against Dragon Man as well here now if you Apocalypse nuke it, but Magneto, White Magneto will. I don't know. I've taken that fight a lot with White Magneto and APOC. I think APOC's going to still be fine, but you know, a longer fight, if you're taking Dragon Man degen, you could die. So I guess that's why they added physical resistance, and it's a little bit harder now. I don't know. I'm not a balance designer. Next up, path 2. So this make a stand node used to be the second node on this lane. Now it's the first, so that's no change. It's just a different order. However, the second node on 7B is a lot harder now because it has standing in fear, which means you stand near them, you put debuffs on them, it's going to feed power creep. So if you don't have somebody who can combat, you know, like a skill, if you can't combat the skill champion with a mutant champion, essentially, the power gain is going to be pretty annoying here, and they're also probably going to go unblockable at times. So this node, because of the addition of standing in fear, is a lot harder. Next up, I think there's only 2 more nodes we have to focus on. 8B, second node, 8B. They added something extremely important to know, which is force of will. Okay, now what does force of will do? No more neutralize. So your Rintras, your Wiccans, your Tigras, they are not effective on this node anymore. As a reminder, it has power efficiency and rich get richer. You usually place somebody with buffs here. It means, you know, you got to use Fate Seal, you got to use Nullify, you got to use things like that, or you have to outwin the rich get richer battle. It's not that bad, but it does mean that you can't use Neutralize. So if you love using Rintra for this fight, like if they place a Gore here and you want to use Rintra, it's like, sorry, you're going to probably have to use Hood now. Not the end of the world, but it's like, it's something you want to plan for, right? Because Force of Will shuts down Neutralize, important to know. And then 9B, it's a little different. It's not that different though. They put the one eye open node second, which again, I don't understand the need to change the order of the nodes and why they do that, but they did it anyway. This is the same as it used to be on the first node. It's now the second node. One eye open, the same shock bleed combo. They got rid of Nerves of Steel that used to be here, and now it's Power Focus 2. So again, like Power Focus 2 is not that bad of a node. If somebody's got a dangerous special 2 like Photon or something, that's gonna hurt, obviously. But you know, in general, it also means you can be more aggressive when they're between 2 and 3 bars of power. So you know, I don't see that being too difficult. Bring the immunities and you should be fine. So again, we already talked about the mini boss island. The only major difference is this last mini boss here. They added brute force to polka dot power and stunning reflection. Anyway, that is my speed through of these node changes. There's a lot different. The flow is going to be a lot different. People are going to have to take more fights. People are going to have to bring counters. I'm telling you now, be prepared to die more. You're going to die more this season. If you have an alliance that plans, I think this is a lot better. If you have an alliance that doesn't plan, which is like, you know, 95% of MCOC, it's going to take some adjusting. It's not necessarily bad. It's not necessarily a lot worse. There's a lot of things that are familiar to it, but watch this video, take some notes. It's going to be different, and you just want to be prepared for it. So that's all I got for you today. Thanks for listening to my video. I hope this was helpful. I may have made some mistakes because I've had less than 24 hours to prep this. If I do make mistakes, let me know. I'll pin a comment. I really appreciate your guys' support. Enjoy the off season, enjoy the rewards, and I'll catch you in the next one.